Calls are mounting for Western nations to lift sanctions on Syria after former President Bashar Al-Assad was overthrown by rebel groups last month. European countries have begun engaging with the new interim authorities, but the EU remains hesitant to lift sanctions before it sees concrete changes in Syria. The issue is once again on the table at a gathering of EU foreign ministers in Brussels.
A diplomatic door opens in Damascus. At the first talks between a European commissioner and the new interim leaders earlier this month, the Syrian ask was clear: end sanctions imposed over Assad-era violations. But the EU answer was careful.
We are waiting for some development, and cautiously. We are here also to encourage the new authorities to build an inclusive Syria, embracing all its citizens, all its diversity.
For years, the EU halted almost all but humanitarian shipments to Syria, stifling the economy to punish the former regime. But in a leaked document seen by DW, Germany, France and others now call for a rethink and swift sanctions relief in some areas to make life simpler for Syrians. Like air travel and jet fuel, to ease travel between Europe and Syria, and potentially to speed up future refugee returns. Then EU exports of some high-value goods like vehicles and oil and gas technology to improve ailing energy infrastructure. Lastly, opening some European banking channels to spur on investment. The EU states say all this should be reversible in a bid to retain leverage over Syria's new leaders. But some experts warn that step-by-step approach may miss the mark.
If you want to promote the transition and if you want to back up the new caretaker government, there's more that you need to do. So I merely see this as symbolic gestures, but the bind for the EU, of course, is how far to go with the new caretaker government, which has Islamist roots and which might also participate in further human rights violations.
And the rebel group leading that new interim government is still labelled a terrorist organisation by the United Nations, something the EU can't change alone. If the bloc wants to support Syrians, it may mean putting faith in the new authorities. It's a political risk, but so is keeping distance while other powers vie for influence over this geopolitical hotspot.
Well, our correspondent Rosie Burchard is at the Foreign Ministers meeting today in Brussels. Good to see you, Rosie. We just heard the EU is carefully approaching Syria, despite the UN still considering the rebels in power a terror group. Can we expect any major changes or developments there today?
We are expecting a change, which is a political decision, as it's called in EU jargon, to move forward with gradual easing of sanctions on Syria. But that's very different from the actual technical details which would be involved in easing those sanctions, which will then be taken up by diplomats after this decision that we're expecting today politically. And the reason that we're not yet at the stage of actually suspending or releasing these sanctions is because there's still some disagreement among EU member states. So there are a group of member states who are ready to release sanctions much more quickly, and especially those which have in the past been very vocal about their desire to be able to return Syrian migrants and refugees and asylum seekers. Think, for example, about Italy, which before the fall of Assad was pushing for normalisation of ties, or at least a consideration of that, with the Assad regime in a bid to speed up refugee returns and potential deportations in future. Then there are a group of countries which are much more cautious and don't want to release sanctions quickly. They're particularly concerned about the role of Turkey. And lastly, the majority of EU member states, I'm told by diplomats at least, are in favour of a more gradual approach. So releasing some sanctions, suspending some sanctions, but being clear about conditions for that in future. So an inclusive government on the ground in Syria, for example, including the rights of women and the rights of minorities like the Kurdish minority. But there are some criticisms toward that approach, and particularly those who say, look, there are no clear benchmarks so far. If you want those now in power in Syria to do something, to, for example, organise elections in a clear way, then you need to be clear about what will happen when that happens and be able to support it. And I think it's worth recalling also that the EU has made very serious accusations against HTS, so that's those now in power in Syria in the past, including of civilian killings and torturing.
Rosie, foreign ministers will also talk about the Middle East as well as EU-US relations. President Trump recently made very controversial remarks about Gaza, basically saying the Strip should be, quote, cleared. How did that resonate with the EU?
Well, that certainly is not the EU's position here. The European Union has been very clear that it wants the ceasefire in Gaza to hold, that hostages must be able to return home, that Gazans must be able to live safely, and that aid must flow into the Strip at a massive level. However, what I don't think we're going to see is the kind of criticism we've seen from the Arab League, for example, that have likened Trump's suggestion or a seeming plan to ethnic cleansing. Instead, I think what we'll likely see here among EU ministers and the European Union generally is a very cautious approach to criticising Trump on the record. I've heard some diplomats ahead of these talks saying, look, we need to keep a cool head in general, because we've learned that not everything that President Trump says at a press conference or in a TV interview actually translates into policy. But of course, it's also worth noting that the whole approach to the conflict in Gaza and to the humanitarian crisis and relations with Israel and the Palestinian Authority are extremely contentious among EU member states and are generally a big source of disagreement here.
DW correspondent Rosie Burchett in Brussels, thank you.